The phone was already lit when I walked past it. I hadn't meant to look. I had come into Ronnie's apartment at 5:30 on a Thursday with a folder of venue brochures tucked under my arm and a habit of moving through his space like it was already partly mine, opening the refrigerator, setting my bag on the kitchen island, filling a glass from the tap. I was 8 months from a wedding. I had earned the right to move that way. The phone was face up on the island, plugged in, screen glowing with a message preview from Diane. I saw her name first, then the first line of the text, and then I picked it up without deciding to. I read for 9 minutes. I know because my phone showed the time when I finally set Ronnie's down. 3 months of messages, 142 of them. I didn't count, I scrolled, and somewhere I stopped registering the words as language and started registering them as shapes. The shapes told me the same thing over and over. Your father thinks she's a better fit. Your father thinks the families align. Your father says give it time, she'll come around, she already has. And then photographs. Deanne in the boutique on Oak Street that I had bookmarked on my own phone and never mentioned to anyone. Diane in a dress the color of winter ice, angled toward a three-way mirror, and Ronnie's text beneath it. She looks the way you're supposed to look. I sat down on his couch. I don't remember making that decision either. What I remember is the light shifting. The apartment faced west, and in early March the sun came through at a particular angle that turned the hardwood floors the color of honey, and it did that while I sat there, and then it went away, and the apartment went dim, and I was still sitting there when the door opened. Ronnie came in already loosening his tie. He saw me before he saw the phone in my hand. His face did something complicated and immediate, not guilt exactly, more the expression of a man who had been waiting for a particular piece of news and felt, alongside the dread, a fractional relief that the waiting was over. Elaine. Sit down, I said. He sat in the chair across from me, not next to me. I registered that. The conversation was quiet. That's the part no one believes when I describe it, years later, in the way you describe things that have already become story. They expect screaming, a thrown phone, a door left open. What they get is, we sat across from each other in the dimming apartment and spoke in the tones of two people in a waiting room. I asked questions. He answered them with the measured cadence of a man who had rehearsed for a version of this scene, though he'd expected a different set of questions. He was sorry. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. He cared about me. He hadn't known how to tell me. My father had approached him last October just to talk, just to share some concerns, and it had seemed like the kind of conversation he could have and walk away from, but Diane had been there and... Stop, I said. I don't need the sequence. I still love you. I looked at him for a long time. He was not a bad man. That was the thing I kept returning to, in the months that followed, every time I felt the urge to make him into something worse than he was. He was an ambitious man who had been handed a plausible alternate life by a person he respected, and he had taken it. That was the whole story. It was not a complicated story. I know you do, I said, in the way you know how to. I took my folder and my bag, and I left. I called Diane from the sidewalk on North Orchard Street, standing under a street lamp that had just come on. She answered on the second ring. I could hear restaurant noise behind her. Are you somewhere you can step outside? I asked. There was a pause, then, hold on. She already knew. I could tell by the quality of the silence she carried with her through the restaurant, and then outside, the particular hush of someone preparing to receive something they have already prepared to receive. What she said was, she loved me. What she said was, she had tried to stop it from going the direction it went. What she said was, she hadn't meant to hurt me. She meant all of these things sincerely, and none of them changed what was true. I listened. I said nothing after the first sentence because there was nothing useful for me to say, and I had already understood, standing in Ronnie's apartment reading those messages, that this was Diane being exactly as much herself as she had always been. She had grown up in a world where certain things organized themselves around status and family connection and the considered management of opportunities, and she had learned to navigate that world so smoothly that even her betrayals came out clean. She hadn't set out to take anything from me. She had simply stopped, at some point, resisting what was being offered. I need you not to call me for a while, I said. Elaine. Not angry, just not yet. I hung up, then I called my father. He was at a dinner. I could hear that too, the particular acoustic texture of a private dining room, a burst of male laughter somewhere behind him. He stepped away from the table the way men like my father step away from tables, with an air of controlled inconvenience. Elaine, what is it? I told him what I'd found. I used short sentences. I was standing on a Chicago sidewalk in March with no coat because I'd left it on Ronnie's couch, and the cold was so immediate and specific that it helped me stay inside myself. There was a silence on his end. Then he said, I did this because I love you. The thing about my father is that he has always believed this. Robert Garner was a man who had constructed a life through force of will and clear-eyed assessment, who had made himself out of nothing, and then spent the next 40 years trying to make the world conform to the shape of that story. When he looked at me, at my photography business, my apartment in Logan Square, my fiancé who was rising but not yet risen, my best friend from the right family who was, he'd decided, a better match than his daughter, he was not being cruel. He was being efficient. He could not see the difference. You arranged this, I said. You approached my fiancé, you coordinated with Diane, and you're going to tell me it was love. You deserve someone who can really provide. Don't. I know this is hard to hear right now. Dad, I stopped walking. Don't explain it to me. I understood it from the messages. Then you understand I wasn't trying to. What I understand, I said, is that you've been trying to fix me my whole life. I think what's different now is that I'm done being fixable. He said nothing. I stood there for another 3 seconds, listening to the private dining room behind him, and then I said goodnight and hung up. I lost 3 days. I don't remember them in any coherent way. I remember the light through my Logan Square apartment windows going from dark to light to dark again, and I remember eating crackers at some point, and I remember the particular silence of my phone after I'd muted it, and I remember thinking, distantly and without much alarm, that I was not functioning. Ree let herself in on the 4th day, using the key I'd given her 18 months prior, for emergencies. She stood in my kitchen looking at the crackers and the muted phone and me, and she made coffee without asking if I wanted any. Ree was my oldest photographer friend. We'd met at a workshop in Michigan, and she had liked me immediately in the direct, somewhat aggressive way she liked most things, and she had said within an hour of meeting me that I had a good eye and a tendency to shoot safe, and that I should stop doing the second thing. She was from Louisiana originally, and had a way of standing in rooms like she owned the air in them. She sat across from me and said, Your father told your fiancé to leave you for your best friend, and both of them went along with it. I looked at her. I'm saying it out loud so you know I know what actually happened, not some softer version. I know what happened. I know you know. I'm saying it so the room knows. She pushed a coffee mug toward me. Now what do you want to do? What I wanted was not recoverable. What I wanted was the morning 8 months ago when I had woken up next to Ronnie and believed, with the easy thoughtlessness of someone inside a life that fits, that the next year would look a certain way. I could not have that morning back. What I could have was the next morning, and the one after that. I think I need to leave Chicago, I said. She looked at me steadily. Where? I don't know. Somewhere I don't have context. New Orleans, she said. I know someone who has a studio in the Marigny, month to month. The light there is different. You'd work. She said it with such certainty that I understood she had already thought about this, that she had come over not only to check on me, but with a plan in her pocket, ready to offer it the moment I was ready to take it. I left in April. The Marigny was a narrow neighborhood of shotgun houses and jasmine-thickened air and light that came off the Mississippi at a particular angle in the late afternoon and turned everything the color of old photographs. I rented a studio apartment on Dauphine Street from a sculptor who was spending a year in Portugal. The walls were painted the faded green of someone who had lived there a long time, and the floors were uneven, and the windows rattled, and it was the first place I'd lived in years that felt unperformed. I didn't photograph weddings for 4 months. I shot the city instead. The way mold grew in patterns on the sides of buildings, the particular quality of a second-line parade when you stood not with the crowd, but at an angle from it, the faces of musicians between songs when they thought no one was watching. I was relearning what it meant to look at something without needing it to mean anything beyond itself. Ree knew people everywhere. She introduced me to other photographers, to gallery owners, to a woman named Celestine who ran a florist shop on Magazine Street and let me shoot her arrangements in exchange for prints. I began to understand that work, when stripped of everything it had been trying to be for someone else, was just the repetitive act of paying attention. I had always been good at paying attention. I had been spending it on the wrong things. By summer, I was shooting weddings again. The first one was a couple from Baton Rouge who had found me through Celestine, a quiet Saturday ceremony at a bed and breakfast in the Garden District, and I drove home afterward through the warm dark feeling something I recognized as continuity. By fall, I had a full calendar. By the following spring, I had a waiting list. I didn't call my father. He called me once in October, and I let it go to voicemail. He said in the message that he hoped I was well, that he heard I was in New Orleans, that he wanted to talk when I was ready. I listened to the message twice and then let it sit in my phone like an unanswered letter. I thought about Ronnie occasionally and without much intensity. I thought about Diane more often and with something that was not quite grief but neighbored it. The strange, specific loss of a friendship so long it had become part of how you understood yourself. She had been, for 12 years, one of my primary mirrors. I was having to learn what I looked like without her. The book event was in September, at a hotel on the Gulf Coast. I got the call 3 days out when the original photographer had a family emergency, and I drove down the morning of the event with my gear in the back of my car and the sea light already doing what sea light does. The author was Theo Miller. I knew the name the way you know names that have been in the periphery of your awareness without landing. Best-selling crime novelist, lauded for something involving atmosphere and procedural accuracy, photographed usually in the context of awards or festivals. In person, he was standing near the hotel bar arguing with a small woman in a blazer who I assumed was his publicist, gesturing at a promotional backdrop with the expression of a man who has agreed to something reasonable in principle and is now confronting its reality. I sat up near the back of the room and watched him from a professional distance. He was tall, with the kind of face that photographs well from certain angles and poorly from others, and he had the specific bodily ease of someone comfortable with their own size. He lost the argument with his publicist about the backdrop. She pointed twice at something in a contract, and he subsided, and then he turned toward the room and caught me looking at him from across it. He didn't look away, neither did I for a moment. Then I went back to my camera. He found me during the cocktail hour. "You're not from the publisher," he said. "The original photographer had a family emergency. I'm the replacement. You've been watching the room for 2 hours without photographing much." "I photograph a lot. You just didn't see most of it." He looked at me with an expression I recognized from shooting strangers, the look of someone genuinely curious rather than performing curiosity. "What do you shoot when you're not being a replacement?" "Weddings mostly, fine art occasionally." "Weddings," he seemed to turn this over. "That's a very specific kind of optimism." "Or documentation," I said. "Depends on the day." He smiled, slow and authentic. We talked for 12 more minutes before his publicist retrieved him. On my way out, he asked for my card. He emailed 3 weeks later about a reading in New Orleans. He had connections to the city. His agent was based there. He came through twice a year, and he was, the email said, constitutionally opposed to being photographed at readings, but had decided to reconsider the position. I photographed the reading. We had dinner afterward at a place on Frenchman Street where you could hear music coming through the walls, and we talked until midnight about work and the problem of making something real in a medium that had been saturated with performance. He told me he'd been divorced for 3 years, with a son who was 14, and spent alternate months between Austin and Boston. He said it without self-pity or the particular forced lightness men sometimes used when they were still raw. He said it the way you say a fact about your life that has already been integrated. I told him, somewhere after the second glass of wine, that I had left Chicago under circumstances that had taken a while to process. I didn't tell him the details. I told him the shape, that someone I trusted had chosen a version of me that didn't exist, and that I had decided to stop providing the raw material for that project. He listened without trying to solve it. That was the thing about Theo. He was a novelist, which meant he understood that a story didn't need to resolve into a lesson. He just let me say the shape of it and then said, "That's a very efficient description of a very complicated thing." I've had time to practice. How much time? Long enough. We saw each other twice more before Christmas, both times in Austin, where he had a house near Barton Springs that smelled like books and cedar. The city suited him, quiet, famous, unpretentious, slightly apart from its own reputation. The third time I came to Austin, I brought 2 days' worth of clothes instead of one. He didn't comment on this, which I appreciated. In March, 2 years after the night in Ronnie's apartment, a bridal magazine ran a 12-page feature built around 6 of my photographs. Ree texted me a screenshot at 7 in the morning with the single word "told you." That same week, Theo's 4th novel debuted at number 3 on the Times list. We celebrated the way people who have stopped performing celebrate. At his kitchen table with Thai takeout and a bottle of wine that was good but not ostentatiously good, talking about work, talking about his son's interest in marine biology, talking about nothing that was performing for an audience. He told me, over the remains of Pad CU, that his son Marcus wanted to meet me. I looked at him. "He's been asking," Theo said. I told him I'd pass it along. "Is that how you pass things along? Over takeout?" "I'm a novelist. I create scenes." What he was saying, under the scene, was that this was something he had decided was real and worth declaring. I sat with that for a moment. It felt like nothing I had expected love to feel like, and exactly like what it actually was. "Tell him yes," I said. My father called in April. His 70th birthday was in June. A party in Nashville, a private club in Belle Meade, 100 guests. He wanted me there. I almost didn't go. I called Ree from my apartment and she said, from 15 blocks away, "Go, take Theo. See what it looks like now that it doesn't have power over you anymore." She paused. "But also genuinely, if you don't want to go, don't go. You don't owe that man a party." I thought about it for 2 days. Then I called Theo. "Nashville," I said. "My father's birthday, June 18th. Ronnie and Diane will almost certainly be there. I would like you to come." He said, "Sure. I've never been to Belle Meade." We drove up from New Orleans. My mother flew in from Seattle. She and my father had been divorced for 11 years and had arrived at a kind of warm détente, and she called me from the airport to say she had already pre-approved my dress choice sight unseen. Nora Garner was the kind of woman who had spent years inside a marriage that required her to be small and then, at 54, had simply stopped. She ran a landscape design business in Seattle now, lived alone in a house with a lot of windows, and had the easy warmth of someone who had decided, at some point, that her capacity for warmth was hers to give on her own terms. She met us in the hotel lobby and held my face in her hands for a moment. "You look like yourself," she said. I hadn't known how much I wanted someone to say that. The party was at a club built in the 1920s that smelled of old wood and recent money. I saw my father across the room before he saw me. He was standing with a group of his contemporaries, and he was smaller than I remembered. Not physically diminished, not exactly, but something in the scale of him had changed. He had been, in my childhood, the size of weather. He was now the size of an old man at his own party, glad-handing with the practiced warmth of someone who understood that warmth was a social tool. I saw Ronnie and Diane near the bar. They were polished. That's the word. Diane had cut her hair and wore something cream-colored and expensive and stood the way she had always stood, with the particular assurance of a woman who has organized her life into its correct arrangement. Ronnie was in a suit that fit the way Ronnie's suits always fit. They looked like a photograph of a life. I watched them for a moment from across the room. Diane said something. Ronnie laughed with his jaw, not his eyes. There was, between them, the specific quality of a silence that people had stopped noticing. Then they saw me. The thing that happened was small and complete. Ronnie went still. Diane's expression did something careful and practiced, and then simply stopped moving, for one unguarded second, into something that might have been recognition. We held eye contact across the room, all three of us in a brief, accidental triangle, and I nodded once and moved away. I didn't speak to them. There was nothing to say that the nod hadn't already said. My father found me near the windows an hour in. He was with a woman I didn't recognize, and then suddenly without her, and he stood in front of me with the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and had already understood that the speech was wrong. "You look well," he said. "Thank you, so do you." Theo was across the room talking to my mother. I had introduced them already, briefly, and my father had shaken his hand with the practiced warmth of someone recalibrating in real time. "I've thought a great deal," my father said, "about the things I did, the way I went about it." "I know. I was trying to." "Dad," I looked at him steadily. "I know what you were trying to do. I understood it then, and I understand it better now." He nodded. His hands were at his sides. He was 70 years old, and he was not going to apologize, not exactly, but he was standing in front of me with the absence of the certainty that had always occupied the space between us, and that was something. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I." It was not forgiveness. It was not the absence of damage. It was just two people at a party standing inside what was true between them without pretending it was something else. We left early. I found Theo and my mother deep in a conversation about native plants of the Gulf Coast, and my mother hugged me at the car with a force that communicated something she didn't need to say. Theo and I walked out through the front of the club into the humid Nashville evening, and somewhere on the path from the door to the parking lot, I started laughing. It came out of me quietly at first, and then less quietly. Theo stopped walking. "What?" "Nothing." I pressed my hand over my mouth. "I mean, I don't know, I was just thinking." "What were you thinking?" I looked at the parking lot, the spill of light from the club's old windows, the sound of the party still audible behind us. "I was thinking that I waited for that room to do something to me," I said. "And it just didn't. It was just a room." He looked at me for a moment. Then he smiled, the slow and authentic one. "Anticlimactic," he said. "Incredibly." We drove back to the hotel, and then south, and I fell asleep somewhere in Tennessee with the window cracked and the warm, dark air coming in. We married in October on a beach outside New Orleans, a rented stretch of Louisiana coast with bad weather in the forecast that showed up 3 hours after the ceremony, which was long enough. Nora was there, and Marcus, who was 16 by then and slightly taller than his father and spent the ceremony standing with his hands in his pockets with the expression of someone genuinely moved who was not going to let on. Ree was there. Celestine was there with her husband. 8 other people I had chosen carefully. I set up a timer on a tripod in the sand, and I ran into the frame, and the photograph that came out was slightly crooked, with sand on the hem of my dress and Theo mid-laugh, and my own face the way my mother had described it in the lobby of the Nashville hotel. I looked like myself. My father sent a card. I set it on the kitchen table and left it there for a week, and then moved it to the drawer with the other pieces of mail I hadn't answered, which is where it still is, or was, the last time I checked. I don't think about checking very often. At 32, what I understand is this. The life I have was not recovered from what happened in Ronnie's apartment. It was not rebuilt from the ruins of it. It was built in a different place entirely, out of different materials, by a version of me who had stopped trying to be readable to people who were looking at something else. My father saw a social equation. Ronnie saw a convenient arrangement. Diane saw an opportunity she had been trained since childhood to recognize. None of them were looking at me. They were looking at the space I occupied and calculating what else might fit there. When I stopped occupying that space, they made different calculations. When I stopped occupying that space, I got to find out what I actually looked like. It turns out the answer is Someone who shoots weddings and loves a novelist and can cross a room without being afraid of what's in it. Someone whose mother holds her face in her hands at hotel lobbies and says you look like yourself. It's not triumph. It's not even resolution exactly. It's just the life that became available once I stopped asking for permission to live it. I'm still taking photographs. That part hasn't changed.